So as a brief review, what happened last week? What's going on? If you could summarize chapter 15, how would you summarize chapter 15?
God made a covenant with Abraham.
That's a good one. God made a covenant with Abraham, made a promise to him, right? Or a covenant. And what was basically the promise?
That he'd be the father of many nations.
And the second part of that, that's true.
The land promise.
Land promise, actually, true as well. And what else? Through him, what was going to happen through him? All nations were going to be blessed. The seed, it was going to, that the Savior, the Messiah, was going to come through his lineage. So that is what Abraham's promise. Now, what made that promise to Abram unusual for how old he was? He was a pretty old man, right? How old was he here? Remember?
About 90.
Oh, not yet.
75.
Well, the promise was given, he was about 75, right? He was about 75. And so, or he was between 75 and 85. We'll say that because it doesn't give us specifics, but it's in that time frame. So he's an older man. Men can have children a lot longer than women can of an age. So true. We're going to get technical. That is true, but you often see young couples when they talk about getting like, oh, so say we're pregnant. That's the man probably overspeaking his bounds, right? Men can bring about children much older in age than women can. We're going to be technical. And Sarah, his wife, what is her age relation to Abram?
About 10 years younger.
About 10 years younger. So if he was 75, she was 65. Is there many 65-year-old women out there having babies? No. Even today, even with all the advancements in medicine, you hear some crazy things from women having kids in their 50s. But still, 65 is way up there. So the promise was made to Abram. In that promise, he was going to have a seed, it was going to be blessed. But in that promise, is anything that we have written down that confirms that it says specifically that it was going to be his wife Sarah's kid?
In the beginning,
But yeah, it's not. It was just said that to Abram. So I'm just trying to lay some groundwork we're going to get into here in 16, because 16 is going to tell us at the very end of chapter 16, in verse 16, that Abraham was 86 years old. So it's 10 years later, the context of this. So they've been waiting on this promise. 75, they were already old. Right? Abram was already old. But now we're at 85, 86, and she would have been 75. So the promise was made, and they believe, but they're going like, this has got to happen soon if this is going to happen, right? So that kind of gets us to where we are in chapter 16. Sarah, it seems, is starting to lose some patience or have some doubts. So she's going to come up with an idea to try to help God's promise along. So I want to read the first three verses, chapter 16.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go unto my maid. It may be that I obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened unto the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife.
Okay. So again, the groundwork's being laid. Sarah, I'm sure had talked with Abram, understood the promise, understood the was going to do Abram's seed, but it's not happening. It's been 10 years and it's not happening. So what idea did she come up with?
give her handmaid his wife.
To give her handmaid or her servant to Abram. Now again, there were things that God winked at in the Old Testament, right? The expression the Bible uses, things that he overlooked. And so there was things like this that went on. There was different rules, like with brothers. If there were brothers and one of the brothers died, it was the other brother's responsibility to take his wife to raise a seed or children to his name. Things that are very unusual or out of custom for us. Even when things like this were brought up with Christ when he was on the earth, and they asked him about divorce and putting away and remarrying, you remember the phrase that he used when he addressed that problem?
It was not so from the beginning.
He goes all the way to the beginning and says, this what you're talking about is not right. God's universal intent from the very beginning was to be one man and one woman forever. That was it. Life.
Because of the hardness of your heart.
And he uses expressions like that. For the hardness of your heart, God suffered you, God winked at. There was things that went on. So again, although not right, customary of the day, they did things like this. Men who had a lot of wealth, who had servants, things like this were done. There were men that had many wives. You look at Solomon, he had thousands of wives, right? From
Many wives and concubines.
right, political expediency and things like that. It recently did. Yes, Joel?
And just to cut, I'm trying to get a thought here. Customs at that time, but even though it's a custom, it says Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put
Right.
that away. So Moses and God giving the law through Moses allowed these things to happen. So anything that is in society today doesn't mean that it's automatically okay, because that's societal
custom,
norm.
right.
Yes. And so, and then Christ supersedes, or, having more authority such, discusses that in Matthew 19, as that's not from the beginning wasn't so. And he's restating it again, kind of going back and holding to what was initially set out by God in marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But anyway, Moses allowed that, God allowing it.
Correct. All correct. And again, it's the idea, I mentioned custom. Customs can be good if customs are set correctly, like your conscience. Your conscience is a very effective guide if it's shaped correctly. Your conscience and customs can be corrupted. Your conscience can become seared like a hot iron, which will allow you to do things which are not right, but doesn't bother your mind anymore. So again, customs, conscience, good. God's word, of course, reigns supreme to that. So Sarah is trying to help out God. She's thinking probably rationally in her mind, this is taking longer than it should. It's not going to happen with me. So maybe we can, take advantage of custom that they lived under and stuff and help God along. Is there anything wrong with that thought?
It was just like that.
God didn't
God doesn't, the whole idea of us, of mankind thinking, let me help God out a little bit here. That's kind of presumptuous, right? So Sarah doesn't need to involve herself in that. Also, but there's probably pressure on her too, because she wants heirs, she wants offspring. Today, most people want to have children. Most people go to great lengths to have children. Back then, it was a super critical urgency. I'm sure we can all think of several examples in the Old Testament where people, it was everything to have children, right? Mostly, again, the male child. They wanted heirs. They wanted to have sons, right, to carry on their name. So it was even a bigger deal. So Sarah is feeling this pressure, and she comes up with this idea. How should have Abraham handled this? With hindsight, how can we go back and say, I know Abraham was, a man of God's own heart. It's harsh to judge people in hindsight, but the Bible is beautiful in the fact that it shows the character flaws, even of his greatest heroes. We've already seen Abram lie about his relation with his wife. So what should have, if we were going to correct things, what should he have done?
You should have said no.
He should, thanks but no thanks.
God promised us.
He-
God promised.
Very simple, God promised us, this is how it's going to be.
Was the promise made to Abram or to Sarah?
It was made to Abram.
So even if he's with Hagar, his seed is still doing what God said is going to be done.
Right. And I'm sure that's what they were thinking. That's what they were.
That may be what they were thinking, right?
I'm sure it was. Now, if that was the case, which we only know what the Bible tells us, so we're kind of supposing here. But if that was the case, what do you think Abram should have done with that scenario brought to him by Sarah? What would have been the right way to handle that? Ask God. God talked to him. Go in prayer. Ask God, is this the way? But he doesn't.
Right.
or not recorded.
Everything's in God's time, not ours.
That's true. And a lot of times God delays intentionally to bring about what he wants in the way that he wants it. Think of anything you've asked for God, you've asked for from God, that you have received. Has it ever been on your timeline? Very, very seldom is it on our timeline, right? You know, usually after many years in hindsight, you're like, oh, I see how that's kind of working out now. Go ahead.
Also, going back to the, Matthew 19, marriage and divorce, sorry, Moses isn't on the scene to give approval for this yet. And so really going back to the way Christ says it to the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
so really there's no approval for even what we have here, whether customary or not. Now granted, we don't have all those details.
Right.
But it's not recorded as such, because we're pre-Mosaical.
True.
So just a thought.
Yep, all true. So again, go ahead, Cody.
I just have a thought, because Ishmael was brought out later, and you mentioned it could have been their understanding, well, this promise made to Abraham, Abraham's seed, which that's human understanding, right? And that's probably why they went into this situation. But it's just really interesting to me that Abraham has Ishmael with Hagar, and it's not the seed that God mentioned. And so that kind of plays into the depth of, the marriage bond and the fact that two flesh become one. And Abraham's promise, was directed to Abraham, but it's dependent on that seed being born of Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah.
Because it becomes her promise just as much as Abraham.
It's a good point, because you think about what the New Testament says about two flesh becoming one, the promise being made to him since he was married to Sarah. The promise was made to her by this, by joint association, right? Even though it wasn't spoken to her.
That's another reason he should have told Sarah no.
Right. Oh, there was a multitude of reasons why he should have told her no. He could have said, okay, I can understand how maybe you think that way, but he's an older man. He's been talking about, he should have some wisdom by saying, one, this is not what, God said it's going to be, our seed. And two, he should have said, this is going to create problems. He should have had the wisdom to foresee that this is going to create problems. And did it create problems?
Yes.
Ooh, it's created problems. It's created a lot of problems. And it's still going on to this day, right? So maybe it made sense. Again, you should have went to God and asked. Should have had a little forethought to say, no, Sarah, that's not right. The promise was made to me and as well as to you. And then the third thing, and this is probably not going to work out good long term. A couple of things I want to mention this in time frame. Again, this idea of waiting on God's time frame. Going forward to when Saul is king, flashing forward, and he's newly appointed king, and he's getting ready to fight the Philistines, and he's told to wait for Samuel. Samuel's going to come and offer the sacrifice before they go and fight. He's told to wait 7 days. 7 days comes and goes, and does Samuel show up? For those who remember the story? No, he hasn't showed up. David's army begins to leave. Saul takes it upon himself. I can't have that. I'll make the sacrifice. He makes the sacrifice. He no sooner gets done than who shows up? Samuel. He goes, what have you done? His impatience. Again, I've got to get this done, or this is not going to work out as far as I can see. And he loses the kingdom. Samuel says, the kingdom is not going to stay with you. Same time frame, you think about David. Was David told he was going to be king? Wasn't he? Samuel told him, right? Samuel anointed him. Who was king, though, at the time? Saul. How many times did David have the opportunity to take Saul's life when Saul was pursuing David? Over and over and over again. So David knows he's going to be king. The king that's in his way right now is trying to kill him. Time and time again, Saul's given into his hands. But what is David? You remember what David says every time?
He said, it's not my place to do it. It's God's place.
Not for God's anointed. He
That's
wasn't
right.
going to take God's anointed.
He said, I'm not going to do it. So David shows the example of waiting for God's time. Saul did not, and here in this case, Abram did not. Anything else in those first few verses? All right, someone read please 4 through 6.
And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes, and the Lord judged between me and thee. And Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thine hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarah dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face.
All right, in these 3 verses, here come the problems. All kinds of continuing bad decisions and all kinds of problems. Sarah's plan works. Here's my handmaid, have a kid by her, and guess what? Hagar gets pregnant. Now, in the King James, it's worded kind of confusingly, at least to me. What begins to happen between Sarai, and Hagar after it's known that Hagar is pregnant?
Conscience or
She starts despising her.
Who despises who?
Sarah
Sarah despised
despises
Hagar.
Hagar. I mean, she kind of blames Abraham.
True, but
She says,
my
"My wrong be upon you."
true. Yeah, we'll get to that. But when you read it, her mistress, and this is King James, the latter part of 4, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Who's the mistress?
Hagar.
It's Sarah.
Sarah.
Hagar begins to despise Sarah. Why? Huh? Put her in a bad position, perhaps. Perhaps. I mean, she didn't want this, right? Maybe she didn't want to be married to Abraham. All possibilities. Because again, she's a servant girl. She didn't have much choice. Where did she probably come from? Going back to the history, the short history you just read already about Abram.
Yes, that's the Egyptian.
Remember he went to Egypt. Remember when he lied about Sarah and found out, because she was taken with Pharaoh. Pharaoh finds out through the plagues that it's actually his wife, and he gives Abraham stuff. Remember the whole list of stuff. He gives him all this animals and stuff, and he gives him men servants and maid servants. Probably where she came from. So she had no say so in the matter. So it might not have been her thing. That's what she wanted. What else, though? Again, historically, going back to the idea of the want for children, what is another possibility that happened here? Yeah. Yeah. She's like, guess what? I'm having the kid. I'm going to one that had become the preeminent one because I'm providing the heirs. And maybe because there is instances in the Bible where women who were barren, the other women who have kids, give the women who are barren a very, very hard time about it. And so all that dynamic is starting to take place now. A foreign woman in your family now, based off your own words, might become the mother of the heir. And now she starts to give some grief back to you. Is that going to go well? No, it's not going to go well at all. What does Sarah do? She goes to Abram and does what? Speak up because I can't hear.
Basically, she said, my wrong be upon thee.
Yeah. Was that justifiable? I mean, whose idea was it? It was her idea. So is Sarah thinking rational right now? No, there's not much rationality going on. She's mad. Maybe rightfully so. So in one sense, she unjustly accused Abram of bringing this about because it was her idea. But in reality, who should have had to say so? Abram. He should have stopped it. He should have said, that's not what we're going to do. So again, one, it's not a fair accusation. But on the other hand, it is a fair accusation. Abram should have never allowed this and never got himself in this situation. Go ahead, Cody.
It's just pretty interesting. It kind of connects back with like Adam and Eve, even though the gender roles are switched there.
Mm-hmm.
With Adam throwing the blame, and instead of Eve But it's just interesting, the sin is brought forth, they both engage in the sin, but once the ramifications of sin become real, they should start pointing fingers.
Nobody wants to take responsibility for it.
Very constant thing.
Yeah. Nobody ever wants to take responsibility. It's very rare for the person to take responsibility for their sin. That's why the example of David with Bathsheba is such a striking example, especially him being in a position of power and authority. For him to acknowledge that sin that quick and try to make it right, that's unheard of, right? This type of stuff you see with Abram and Sarah, with Adam and Eve, that's the type of thing we're used to seeing. The deflection, the blame is over here, it's not me. That's what we typically see, how people react.
Sarah blamed God in verse 2, now she's blaming Abram in verse 4 through 6.
She's lashing out. I mean, she's got a lot of blame she wants to throw around. And again, nothing was her fault. Just, biologically speaking, right? God was going to provide this. But once she decided to help God and once she saw things again not going her way, she becomes angry. Abram still could have fixed this. But what does he do in verse 6?
Do unto her as you thought, what's he do?
Takes the easy way out. He could have stepped up, right, and said no. I mean, there's all kinds of things he could have done. She's my wife. We're going to set her up over here. I'll find her another husband in our family there. Or he is a man of great wealth. He could have sent her back home with an entourage, right? Here, go back to your home country. Go, find you a husband. Here's everything to support what's going to happen. He could have done all kinds of things like that. But what does he do? That's your servant. Do what you want to do to her. Yeesh. There's a whole saying about the woman scorned or whatever right now. So what does Sarah do?
Treats her harshly.
Doesn't go into details, but treats her harshly. Treats her horribly. I mean, there's no godly characteristic going on in any of this right now. None of it. It's a horrible situation. Let's continue reading on though. 7 through 14.
Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, on the spring the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress of Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress, and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. Because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees, for she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered.
Okay, so Sarai is treating Hagar horribly, so horribly that she decides she has to flee. She has no recourse. So can you imagine she's far enough along now to know she's pregnant, and now she's going to try to take off in this rugged country on her own. Does anybody know where she's going? Again, the Bible doesn't say, but have an idea or heard where she was going?
Probably Georgia.
It's going the direction of where they're camping and where this place is, sure, it appears she's heading back home, which makes sense, right? She's going back home. So she's at this fountain. She's at some water in the wilderness, which is a nice thing to find in the wilderness. She's taking some comfort there, some refreshment. And who comes to see her? The Lord. There's so many times, again, the idea, it doesn't go into detail, but we assume, or I assume, that he appeared in the form of a man because she's talking with him, right? You remember that big word I've mentioned sometimes about when God appears in human form. Theophany, I believe it is. So often the case that an angel, or perhaps even the Lord himself, appears to talk with man, and sometimes they realize it's God or an angel. Sometimes they don't, or sometimes they don't realize towards the end when things happen. Something mystical kind of happens at the end. They're like, "Oh, that wasn't just a man. That was God, right?" So he goes to talk to her. What does he ask her? Where are you going? What are you doing? It seems strange to me that God asks questions whenever he deals with man that he obviously knows the answer to. It's almost like, again, with Nathan and David, presenting a case or asking a question to get you to response, to get you out of just reaction, but to process what you're doing and think about it. Maybe have some self-realization, like this is not the best path. This is not what I should be doing. What else is unusual or different in verse 8 of how Hagar has been addressed up until this point? How is Hagar referred to up until verse 8? Maid, servant, and all that stuff. When the Lord shows up, how does he address her? Calls her by her name. Calls her by her name. So it's not just that she's a servant girl, she's this. He actually addresses her and sees her for who she is. There's some power to that. There's some importance to that. Think about how God sees us. It's just not a random person. He sees Bill, he sees JT, he sees you for who you are and addresses you that way. So there's some power to that. Did Hagar answer both questions posed to her? She only answered in part.
Kind of in part, because she said she's just fleeing, but from her mistress.
Yeah, she
Doesn't
doesn't.
say where she's going.
She doesn't give all of it, right? She answered the part. What did you say, Katie?
Jesus' why, she would say where or
Yep.
or
She just says, I'm fleeing from the face. And she doesn't even really, at least it's not recorded, she even gives a reason. Just that I'm fleeing.
Kind of a fight or flight reflex. I just have to get out.
Yep.
Wherever I go is better than where I've been.
Right. And then what does the angel tell her? Like, there's not a whole, you would almost assume there's got to be more discussion going on where it's given like a condensed version. What are you doing? Where are you going? I'm running away from interest. You need to go back. You think that's what you wanted to hear? Ugh. Can you imagine going back?
To submit yourself, would you?
Yeah. She doesn't even say like, I'm gonna fix this for you, I'll make it easy when you go back. There's none of that being promised that's recorded. He just says, go back and submit. And that's the simplest of phrase, but the toughest of things to do. It's hard to submit when you think you're being treated unfairly. I mean, can you think of situations in your life when you've been treated unfairly, like I said, maybe as a kid growing up by your parents, you thought, or at your job, and you talk to a friend or someone you think can give you some good counsel, and they say, just go back and submit to that. That's probably not what you want to hear. They're going to want to hear it if you're in America, right? Oh, you have rights. Don't do this. Do that. Get you a lawyer, whatever. Get you another job. Get out of that house. Very seldom go back and submit. What does it show about Hagar and how she reacts to that? Her faith. I mean, the fact that she's willing. I mean, she's already, like I said, halfway run away. She's out of there. And that she is going to go back.
I think building on that, it displays a developed faith. In Egypt, she was not subjected to Jehovah, right?
Yeah.
Abraham brings her into her house. She's subjecting to Jehovah, even though Abraham whole situation. Most other people, like, let's say you're in a relationship with someone, you convert them, that relationship ends, it's likely that that person that was converted is going to fall away too. I'm done with them, and I'm done with their God. Not Hagar. It shows a pretty developed independent faith.
Sure. It also, what you're saying reminds me of something, or brings to mind something else. If she goes back to Egypt, what happens to her eternally? More than likely, lost, right? So you can think, I mean, put yourself in situations even today where you tell someone advice that is counterintuitive to the best result that you can see here on this earth, but has a much better result for you long term. Her going back, no matter how hard it would be to go back and face Sarah, no matter how hard her life might have been living there, eternally, what's it going to get for her? She goes back and follows God's will. Kind of like Ruth. She could have gone back to her people, but what was Ruth's famous saying she said? In the second half?
My God will be your God.
That's a big one there. Your gods will be my gods. That's the big thing. So we are so concerned about making things right or easy or comfortable here that we can't see the spiritual end sometimes. Whereas the angel's advice here seems kind of short, maybe even harsh, but long term, absolute best thing she could have done for herself. It's very, very hard to see that. And like Cody said, speaks to her maturity somewhat that she says, okay. Doesn't act like she doesn't not record it. She argued, kind of Abraham a lot, was there 50 righteous souls? Is there 40? All that's, okay, I'm going to go back. Speaks really, really highly of her, right? She's given a promise. What promise was she given, though? Yeah, we can't understand how important that was to people back then. She's given the promise of having that almost parallel to the promise of Abraham, that a mighty nation was going to come from her, a mighty people. And the second half of it, so that would be comforting. But then the second half of that to me is kind of unusual. What does the angel tell her about her descendants?
They're going to be against everybody else, and they're not going to be against them.
That they're going to be wild men. That they're going to be their hand against everybody, and a hand against everybody else is going to be against them. Now, if someone told me about my kids, and this is how your kids are going to be, your kids are going to be wild, they're going to be fighting everybody's going to be fighting them, I'm like, yeesh, that's not a good thing. I need to step it up here and try to fix that before that happens, right? But he tells her that, and I guess, I don't know if it's just, the idea of masculinity or the fierceness of a people. That's how it was back then, that was a good thing, as she thought. Or it's just, I don't, it's not recording her reaction, but I'm curious of her thought process on that. I can understand having a bunch of descendants would have been encouraging, but the idea of them being a fierce people is just unusual to me.
I know, like, ancient mindset, a lot of people connected fertility with you're standing with a higher power of some sort. So she probably believed that in Egypt. She probably sees that now with Abraham. And she's thinking, okay, Abraham is a good master, good servant of the Lord, has all these redeeming qualities. He hasn't even had a child yet. Maybe I'll just take what I can get. Because I'm not much better off than he is.
He then tells her, the angel tells her what to name the child. In the name of Ishmael, what does that name mean? God hears. So he heard Hagar's plight. He heard her mistreatment. So he heard her. Again, when he shows up, he calls her by name and talks to her. In verse 13, it talks about what she called the place where she spoke to the Lord. She called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me, or art a God that seeth. For she said, I also here looked after him that seeth me. Wherefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So she gets the name for her son, God hears. And then she names a place. It has in the sense, or in the name of that place, God sees. And that's what when she calls him now God, that name for God, she uses El Roi, R-O-I. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. But that's what it means, the God that sees. So the idea again that God, hears all, God sees all. Even look at the idea of different representation of God. You ever notice, like on the money, where it shows the symbol of the pyramid, the eye. That's actually, I found that's actually a representative of God. It's the all-seeing God. So he's represented just by an eye, because that's what he is all-seeing. He sees everything, which I didn't know that before, so I thought that was interesting. Anything else in that section right there?
Curious what the angel appeared to her as, because it could have just been a man. Somebody addressed her without, it appears in the additional conversation, somebody that appeared with enough authority and told her to go back, and she listened to it.
Yeah, there was definitely, she obviously by the names, she understood who she was talking to, but we're not told how that to be. Because there's a bunch of instances in the Old Testament where this is recorded, right? Where they see it's a man coming, right? Get up, invite him into their tent, cook for them, they eat, they talk with them, tell them certain things. And then something usually happens, something triggered where they realize, oh, that's unusual, right? There's a miracle performed. There's something that shows that it wasn't just a man. So whether this person that greeted her, and I assume it was a person because like I said, you're talking with them, but I don't even know that. It could have been out of a burning bush. Who knows? It could have been anything. But somehow, God spoke with her. She realized who she was talking to. It says an angel spoke to her, and she realized who it was, and followed that. And even though the scripture says it's an angel, when she talks about it, she talks about it in terms of God, right?
This V-E-R, you said God sees?
El Roi, the last part of it, you see in the King James, in verse 14, it says, Bir Lahai Roi.
Right.
That part at El Roi is how she refers, when she uses the word God, that's how she refers to him.
God sees.
It talks about this, that let me see here, a God that seeth, an all-seeing God.
These places would have been still called that, because when Moses was writing this, isn't he with the children in the wilderness? So
Right.
these places would have meant something to them.
You would think so. You would believe that these places, the names, would either, like I said, especially if they were named that then, they would still be called that now, or at least they'd have the historical context to understand. Oh yeah, I know that. I know where that is. We might have been there. Again, they even pointed out that in one of the things I read that the fountain she stopped at might have been one of the fountains that they stopped at coming back out of Egypt, coming back the other way. It might have been the one where the water was bitter, and Moses, God told him to put a tree or something in there, or grab a tree, and it changed some bitter waters to sweet. I think it's called Mara or something like that. It might have been that place. They don't know for sure, but it's possible. Last two verses, I'll read them. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. So he's 86 right here. And then when the promise came to him in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, 75. So we're 11 years in right now, and he's had a son, but it's not the son of the promise. Again, history tells us a few things. Again, going back to who Ishmael was. I've read several different things on this. Some say maybe not true. Some people say it might just be claimed to be true. But the idea, again, of this man being a wild man, this guy's hand being against every man, every man's hand against him. You know what, I guess, well-known historical figure claimed to be a descendant of Ishmael? Everybody's mouthing, so if you're going to actually speak up for me. Muhammad claimed that, which is the founder of the Muslim religion, he claimed to be a descendant of Ishmael and claimed that rightfully the promise should have been to Ishmael and his descendants as opposed to Israel. And therefore the conflict that still rages on over there could perhaps be tied back to right here. Always going to be a fight amongst those people until God comes again. that conflict will continue on. Anything else in chapter 16?